Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Sim. I'm Director of the Global Academy of Agriculture and Food Security here at the University of Edinburgh. It's my great pleasure to co-chair this next session with my friend and colleague, Dr. Pat Conrad from the University of California, Davis. Pat will introduce herself in a second or two. Quite rightly today, we've heard much about interdependence and interconnectedness of things. And our global academies here in the University of Edinburgh are a focal point for interactions across schools and colleges and disciplines around some of the grand challenges that we face in our research, in our teaching, in our education. We heard from Hannah Ritchie this morning about the need to achieve balance in our deliberations, and never more so than in considering agri-food systems. Many of us in this university and many other institutions around the globe are excited and energized about reimagining agri-food systems to help deal with some of the challenges that were eloquently described this morning. And it's good to see these topics getting a good airing and increasing prominence in the Planetary Health Alliance meeting that we're enjoying at the moment. So Pat, without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, I am based at Davis, but I'm also part of the leadership of the 10-campus University of California Global Health Institute. And as with Jeff and all of the other speakers, my bio sketch is there available for you all to see. But you know, when Wendy was talking this morning, something she said made me realize that there was a big omission in my bio sketch. And that's when she asked us all to close our eyes and imagine a child under the age of 10, so if you haven't done that, do that now, okay, who is going to be our elder and lead us through this conference. And when I did that, what I saw were the faces of my sons. Now, I had to flash back about 20 years to get them under 10, all right, but I did that. And I realized, you know, they were the ones who enlightened me first to the beauty and the fragility of this planet, and also inspired me really on the path of planetary health, even before it was called that. And so now they're working and trying to get Alejo and trying to get investments in sustainable ocean fishing set up in Chile, and my younger son Ian using his talents in photography, videography, and storytelling to help promote conservation. And as I look out at all of you, especially the young faces, and at my age, that's anyone under the age of 45, all right? But your young faces, you are the inspiration. You are the future. So we want you to really get involved, okay, in this conference. And in this session, we have the largest and I think the most eclectic session. We have people from many different disciplines, working in different geographies, on different topics. And so we want you to think out of your box, all right? We want to think about the interconnections between what they're going to be telling you, planetary health, and also that other key point that was made. Be thinking about how what they are sharing and what you know in this area, how that can be applied to developing, as Andy Haynes said, solutions to some of the great planetary health challenges that we and you, especially the younger generation, will be facing. All right? So as you do that, we're going to go through. It's going to be pretty quick, and then we're going to hopefully have a good bit of time for questions, and we're going to take that little time to chat back and forth, come up with those really clear, concise, I don't like that word proper so much, but I get the point, questions that'll lead to some real transformative thinking. All right? So be considering that. And should we go ahead and start then, Jeff? Okay.
So it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Dave Ray, who's Professor of Carbon Management and Education here at the University of Edinburgh. In his own words, his research has taken him from stormy seas in the Southern Ocean to evil-smelling Scottish ditches. Now, good news just in. The mid-conference tour to visit the evil-smelling Scottish ditches still has some places available. So see Dave later if you'd like to join that. I think they had a problem with their marketing. Dave.
Thank you, Jeff. So, I'm going to keep it very short, and it's going to be a little bit eclectic, this. And if you've got any devices on hand, then turn them on, get them ready, because I'm going to give you a URL that you are really going to want to record, put into your devices. And it's all about this wonder stuff, I call it. It's about nitrogen and planetary health that I want to tell you about. And it's been mentioned a little bit already today in quite a few different contexts. And I want all of us to take ourselves back to high school. Do you remember in high school when you first were taught the periodic table, probably in chemistry class? And it was one of those classes for me where we had a lot of fun. We had a brilliant chemistry teacher. He was called Mr. Davies. I grew up in North Wales. He was really enthusiastic about chemistry. And he started off with hydrogen, and that was a great element to do. I don't know about you, but we had test tubes of hydrogen, and we put a lighted match in, and it went pop. And I remembered hydrogen. And the next week, we had helium. And helium was great because Mr. Davies brought in helium balloons, which were floaty. But then the bad boys at the back of the class worked out if you breathe in helium, it gives you a really squeaky voice. So these elements were really embedding it into our mind. We're getting excited. Carbon, which I work on a lot now, that was kind of interesting. In Wales, coal was a big thing. So we had a piece of coal. We looked at the energy you get from coal. And then Mr. Davies came in the following week, and it was nitrogen. And this is what we looked like. Mr. Davies, you could see the kind of stress on his face. And he said, well, nitrogen, you need to remember, is really common. As we breathe in now, 78% of the air we're breathing in is nitrogen. It's got a really inert triple bond. Remember that. There's not going to be a practical. We were all disappointed. And I thought, wow, nitrogen is pretty dull. But it's not. Nitrogen, yes, in its unreactive form that we're breathing in now, is inert and it has limited number of uses. But there's a proportion Mr. Davies forgot about. And it's the reactive nitrogen, which feeds all life on Earth. It's part of all life on Earth. It feeds about half of us in here would not be here if it weren't for our human control over the global nitrogen cycle and our production of reactive nitrogen. But with it comes some serious global challenges. And we talked about some of these already today. So if we look at air quality, for instance, so things like PM 2.5 and the role of ammonia in terms of emissions from agriculture, NOx emissions as well, huge impacts around the world, millions of people having shorter lives because of reactive nitrogen being in the wrong place at the wrong time. We know in terms of biodiversity that acidification of our ecosystems used to be largely down to sulfur deposition. Now it's reactive nitrogen is the dominant cause of acidification. For our agricultural systems where we need to grow more food, inefficient application of nitrogen means extra emissions of nitrous oxide, a really powerful greenhouse gas, and we also lose a lot of the reactive nitrogen to our water systems, causing pollution, causing algal blooms that are also mentioned earlier, that eutrophication issue, again, with big issues for ecosystems, for fisheries, and for human health. It's huge challenges around the world in terms of nitrogen and planetary health, but I think it's a wonder stuff. The reason I think it's a wonder stuff is because we already, like I say, feed billions of people through our control of the reactive nitrogen cycle. If we can get that control better, if we can improve nitrogen use efficiency, so take that field up there on the top left into something where the nitrogen, the access to nitrogen fertilizer is increased, and also our precision application of nitrogen can allow us to grow food more efficiently, more productivity with less nitrogen pollution, then we can start to address some of the big challenges we're talking about at this meeting. So this is my big plug. And this is something which I really hope you look at. It's the product of about a year's work. Hannah Ritchie, who you heard this morning, was a key person in helping us to build this. It's a MOOC, a massive open online course called Nitrogen, a Global Challenge. You can see the tiny URL there. And it launches today. So we've been holding it back to launch it for this planetary health meeting. And I hope you'll look at it even if you think nitrogen's dull. And I promise you'll think it's slightly less dull at least. And I hope you'll be quite excited by it. My main hope for it is that it increases awareness. We've talked about communication and education being a key barrier for a lot of the progress we want to make. This is a small part of that on nitrogen and planetary health. And also hope all these years later, if he's still around, Mr. Davies will be Googling at some point this week, and he'll put in the periodic table, and he might look up nitrogen, and he will find a MOOC from his board student, Dave Ray, all those years ago, and he will be proud. So for Mr. Davies, I hope you like it. Thank you all.
Okay, it may be launched, but don't look at it till after 5 o'clock, okay? Till we finish up, 5:30. All right, so our next speakers, it's a team in the spirit of planetary health. We have a team approach. Peter Masofi, do you want to come on up? Peter Masofi, who's a professor and the Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Dodoma in Tanzania, and Valtrina Smith, who's also a professor, and she's the co-director of the Planetary Health Center of Expertise for the University of California Global Health Institute.
Okay, thank you. So Peter and I are going to tell you a story. I'll start for just a few minutes, and then I'll hand it over to him. So our topic for today, we're going to take you to Tanzania, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the environmental and socio-economic drivers of disease risk that we've experienced and thought about as part of our partnership. The multi-campus Planetary Health Center of Expertise that Pat mentioned is something that we're really trying to move from ideas to action. And so over the past 1 to 2 years, we've been able to launch a number of research initiatives, have seed grants, launched multi-campus online and field courses, as well as ambassador programs. And so for University of California out west, we're really trying to tap into the 250,000 students and the 20,000 faculty that we think may have really exciting solutions to offer. So I hope over the next couple of days, and maybe as an action item for 2018 for all of you, we can find a way to take a small action, each of us, so that it starts to chip away and make a difference. And we'll talk a little bit about ideas on that here. So we're going to take you to East Africa. We thought we'd go over to Tanzania. We've been working there as a partnership between the veterinary school at UC Davis and the veterinary school at Sokoine University of Agriculture for over 10 years now. This is the Health for Animals and Livelihood Improvement Project, and it's very community-based, Tanzanian-led, but a hybrid of the UC Davis postdocs and staff and faculty to try and really form a strong partnership for community-based solutions. So as we think about things going forward and how we can provide food as an example and different resources that we need for communities amidst the growing populations, but the limited pressures and all of that, we really want to think about these cross-cutting themes. So One Health is one way to really think about how do we bring in culture, behavior, economics, beyond just the health training that many of us came to the table with. And that's really the transdisciplinary aspect of One Health. And we want to try and think about what's the community that each of us can take action in, right? All of you have a community, maybe where you grew up, maybe where you work, maybe where you live, where you can have a voice. And so I would encourage all of us to think of a way that we can use our voice to really take action about something we care about. Hopefully at the higher levels as well, but really at your local community, I think, is where we can do some fabulous research as well as really advocacy and try out new solutions. And that's, I think, where we want to go with this project in the future. So I think most people are familiar, but this idea of One Health just means that we want to work across disciplines, work across sectors to find new solutions, and to really recognize that it's that confluence of animals, people, and the environment where many of the really fascinating and challenging problems of our time will come to bear. And so there's a number of drivers. Peter will talk a little bit about that. But we also have these cross-cutting influences of the culture and economics, et cetera, that play into the problems that we see. And what I find in a lot of the teaching and research I do is if we have a problem-based scenario, that brings people from many disciplines to the table. And so if we want to solve a specific problem, I think that is the way to really bring a group together, take a One Health approach to solving planetary health problems. So if we think about what happens with the environment, right, shifting environments, we've heard about that already, and that has a number of additional effects that come out of that, right? So we heard about air pollution as an example in the last round of talks that we had. And then those environmental pieces will shift out to health effects. So the environmental pieces have been fairly obvious to me, but I actually hadn't recognized a number of the socio-economic drivers that really come in very closely and become very important when we think about lever points or places where we can take interventions for change. So with the work that I do in Tanzania, I do infectious disease epidemiology. I work on zoonotic diseases like brucellosis and bovine tuberculosis. And the figure you see shows the typical transmission. We think about what's the disease we see in people, what's going on with animals for disease or as reservoirs, and what's happening with the environment. And due to the increases in technology, we're better at finding pathogens, at looking at how do they move, and we're seeing that the environment plays a really important role of connectivity, right? So we can find tuberculosis in the water, in the household dust, in the animals and people, and we can really think about how that's going to shift as both the environmental pieces and the socioeconomic pieces change. So I want to hand over to Peter. I think I would introduce him as a chicken whisperer. He is the best trainer I've ever met in community settings and is very inspirational at many levels. So I'd like to let him tell you in his words a little bit about what he's experienced.
Thank you very much, Ortina. We are talking about socio-economic drivers of infectious diseases. And I worked with chicken in Nepal, in Ghana, in Tanzania, in Uganda, Kenya. And I know a little bit about chicken because chicken stay with the people. The chicken that I'm talking about are not the chicken that are raised in big farms. They are raised in smallholder farms. Now, when you talk about the drivers, things that can drive diseases, especially the socioeconomic part of that, we're looking at things like poverty, demography. We're looking at things like how we keep, the way we keep animals. There are our ways of keeping animals. A Maasai has a way of keeping animals, and there's no way you can change that. Weather, we talk about weather. There's a lot of changes in the weather nowadays. The rain comes at an unexpected rate and volume. So today I picked one item because each one of them requires a day or two to discuss. So I just picked a small one called poverty. Poverty. I'm saying that poverty robs a person the ability maybe to make rational decisions. So we may blame everybody who is involved in the making decisions about things that can actually affect their health, but it's because they've robbed that ability to decide. So there's one thing that I want you to see there, that there's a lot of changes. If you look at that, there's a river flowing, and now that river is gone, and this is not a fiction, it is true. The picture was taken in the same spot. So why do I say that poverty can rob somebody, their decision faculties? Where do we live? So somebody who is poor may decide to build his house or her house in a flood plain. Why? Because that's the only place that is available. But if you look at that picture and you look at what might happen after that kind of flood, you know that all the diseases that are waterborne have been invited to that particular community. So what are we saying? Is it their fault? But again, poverty can also rob the person the ability to think of where to put up a shelter for the birds. I am a chicken expert, so chickens feature strongly. But this could have been pigs. This could also have been cows. That the placement of the shelter for the animals was right in a floodplain. This is what happens. Now, you have to believe me that some of these chickens will not end in the dust pit. Some of these chickens will end up in the food chain, human food chain. So you can imagine the type of disease that can be shifted from that particular place into the plate of some of the people. Well, where you do your business, where do you sell, where do you buy? That's a pretty, bustling marketplace somewhere. The people who buy there, the people who sell there, they know that it's not good for their health. But what can they do? That's what they are thinking. What can we do? This is the only place that we can do without being harassed. Maybe the only place where we don't have to pay to do business. Where do you eat? While we decide to go out eating into, good restaurants, Michelin chefs and all that, some people this is where they eat. And for now, they're okay with it But that's because, again, their decision-making process has been interfered by poverty. They feel that this is the only place that they can get that cheap food. So, survival for the next day is all that people who are poor think about. So where poverty lives, decisions are made for surviving. Long-term does not cut, because long-term means you'll still be here. They're not even sure that you will be here in the next few days. So risk of infectious disease spread, they are kind of secondary. The most important is shelter, food, and clothing, the very basic need of a human being. So without tackling poverty, infectious disease will continue to spread, especially in those areas where poverty is prominent. So to fill the minds, you must also start by feeding the bellies. So when we discuss matters of planetary health, it's important to look at those key drivers that, although kind of hidden, but they actually exert more pressure, they exert more pressure on the minds of the people who need to act. So one of the action points that I think is very, very important is that when you look at what we should do, what action should be on the ground, I would say one of them should be to do as much as we can to reduce poverty, because poverty hides a lot of other things. One of them is lack of education. Lack of good education is hidden within the poverty realms. So, as I conclude my talk this evening, I would really like us to think of how do we help each other dealing with poverty? Is it policies that are preventing us from climbing out of poverty? Is it education? Is it the way we do things? Or is it just a mindset? So I'll leave it there by saying that, indeed, among the socio-economic drivers of infectious disease, poverty should be looked with a very glaring eye. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter and Valtrina, for excellent talks there. The first panel session this morning urged us to move from definitions to solutions, and it's great to hear such practical actions underway there. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Hiral Shah, who's a PhD candidate at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change at Imperial College London. Hiral was an employee at the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, and prior to that in the Zoonotic Disease Department for Public Health in India. But he's going to talk to us today about agricultural land use and infectious disease risks in Southeast Asia, a systematic review and meta-analysis.
So thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much to the committee for giving me the opportunity to actually present over here. So my talk is, as they mentioned, infectious diseases associated with agriculture in Southeast Asia. And I'm going to give you a brief outlook to what sort of exposures we're looking at in terms of agriculture and land use, and then carry on forward with my methods and results. There we go. So, what is land use, or land use change and forestry activities? These are basically, it's a natural modification of any sort of land for human purposes. So you can see on the screen at the minute that these can include deforestation, agriculture, dam building, road building, dam reservoirs, or mining as well. Now, a lot of these activities actually produce large social and economic benefits, such as agriculture provides food for people, dams and reservoirs, water and electricity, road building gives access to people. But a lot of these activities also have disbenefits at the end of the day. And these can be, increased carbon emissions, increased air pollution, loss of biodiversity, changing weather patterns, degradation of water quality, loss of freshwater supply, and potentially infectious diseases. And what I'm actually really interested in is how does this land use or exposure to land use impact the risk of infectious disease in humans? And the first thing that I would normally do is always go back to literature, and you can find quite a few publications really on how land use might impact infectious disease risk in humans. These are all fantastic publications which describe the mechanisms of how exposure to land use impacts infectious disease risk. And the general idea is that land use occurs, there's an ecosystem change which leads to a change in the host abundance or parasite abundance or vector abundance, and that leads to a potential increased risk in humans. But the one thing that I found about these actual publications is that nobody's been able to systematically quantify the risk involved. And so that's what we tried to set out to do. So the idea was to conduct some sort of systematic review. And the question that we set ourselves was, is occupational or residential exposure to differing land uses associated with infectious disease prevalence in humans? Now, in terms of exposure, if I break that down, that basically means whether a person works in or lives near a type of land use, so such as agriculture, mining, reservoir, livestock. The comparator we looked at was whether a person does not work in any sort of land use, and the outcome was prevalence of infectious disease. And we were looking for peer-reviewed observational or randomized control trials. The location was Southeast Asia, and we were looking at all infectious disease in humans in Southeast Asia. So you might ask, why Southeast Asia? Well, Southeast Asia is actually one of the most rapidly developing areas in the world, with a large sort of biologically diverse setting as well. It's also the setting where novel diseases such as Nipah or H5N1 have emerged in the past years as well. And so it provides a really ideal focal system and model system for us to try and conduct this review. And we looked at quite a few databases as well, so PubMed, Embase, Medline, they're all on the screen there. And we followed the Cochrane methodology, which is the gold standard for systematic review. And the data we were looking was really looking at prevalence data, which could be stratified by the different land use exposures. And we managed to even conduct some meta-analyses, which I'm going to present now. So the first thing I want to say is that if you're going to try and do a systematic review on this, make sure you have enough time. We started off with 15,000 publications, and we only ended up with 34, which we included in our review. And 36 actually. And of the 36, 34 were to do with agriculture as an exposure, one was to do with mining, and one was to do with reservoirs. So the first thing that you can see is that there's clearly a lack of research looking at this proximal risk factor of land use or agricultural land use and infectious disease. And so what we did was we put all of these results into one logistic regression model. And I hope you can see up on the screen actually that we managed to find a significant effect. So people working in or living near agriculture are 54% more likely to be infected than people not exposed to that agricultural land. And the issue is, though, is that we've lumped everything together. So there's a lot of heterogeneity involved. And that's between study heterogeneity. Different exposures, different types of agriculture, different sorts of diseases. And so what we tried to do was we tried stratifying as well. So we stratified by exposure first, and you can see that the association still holds true for just agriculture as a general category. But there's two results that I want to point out here. For palm oil and for rubber plantation, which is forest monoculture-based farming, so you cut down or deforest a whole area, and then you plant a single species of crop, the risk involved was significant. I think it was 3.2 for palm oil and 2 point something for rubber farming as well. So really high. In terms of livestock farming and rice paddy farming, although we didn't find a significant association, that's not to say there's no association there. There's different types of livestock involved, different infectious diseases, and so there's a possibility that there could be some diseases which are associated, others there might not be as well. Now, if you stratify by disease, again, we find significant associations for 5 of them. So hookworm, malaria, scrub typhus, which is Orientia, spotted fever, and Trichuris trichuria, we find significant associations with agriculture. And they're quite strong as well. A few things. So there's some reasons why we don't actually see associations as well for some of the diseases. So if you look at Ascaris, which is at the top, Ascaris, hookworm, and Trichuris trituria are all helminths, and so they're all worms. And the mass drug, the intervention for these types of diseases is mass drug administration. But the efficacy for these interventions, it's 80% for Ascaris and only 30% for hookworm and for Trichuris, which is why we don't see a signal for Ascaris. Another example is with Orientia or with spotted fever and Rickettsia typhi. They're all typhus-based diseases, but Orientia and spotted fever are tick-borne diseases, whereas Rickettsia typhi is flea-borne. So that hopefully explains some of the reasons why we might see some signals and the reason why we don't see signals in other areas. We also tried looking at, potentially trying to understand whether there was any effect modification with the data we have. So we tried stratifying by different study characteristics. And the one thing I want to sort of point out is that you can see the association doesn't really change at all. It's pretty consistent with on the right-hand side of that line of no effect. Any time that the confidence intervals do cross the line of no effect, it's purely down to sample size, which provides further validation that there is a potentially strong association between exposure to agriculture and infectious disease risk. And as any systematic reviewer would say, that publication bias is obviously possible, so we also looked at publication bias. And this is a funnel plot which shows a precision versus the actual log odds ratio. And most of them clump towards the top, which indicates very little possibility of publication bias. So there's obviously limitations with this study as well. The significant amount of heterogeneity we found, and at the end of the day, we're working with proximal risk factors, so very upstream risk factors. So there's bound to be heterogeneity involved between studies. Confounding and effect modification. So we just heard about socioeconomics playing a part in disease as well. So, and the link of poverty to infectious disease, and there's bound to be other socioeconomic variables involved that could potentially confound or modify the effect that we've seen. As I stated before, there's a lack of published research as well, and most of the research that we found was either case control studies or cross-sectional studies. And so there's a real need for further sort of research to be conducted in this area. And finally, this was an exploratory study, so there's a real need to be looking at the spatial and temporal association too of these associations, because they might be transient. So I think what I've sort of shown is that there is a strong association, but there's a need to try and understand whether this is a causal effect. We need to understand how socio-economic plays a part and how global trade can have these local health impacts in the supplier countries. And then we also need to look at how demand and supply side interventions might mitigate these future risks. For example, behavior change might be a demand side intervention, or a supply side intervention is sustainable intensification. So in conclusion, I think I've essentially shown that there's a strong association between being exposed to agriculture, either occupationally or residentially, with the odds of infection. We see strong associations with forest monoculture and with multiple diseases, but we do need to assess causality. With these results, there is a golden opportunity really for the environmental sector, the land use sector, and the human health sector to really work together to understand these risks and try and mitigate them before they even happen. And firstly, thank you to the committee again, and thank you all for listening to me drone on about my research, and thank you to the following people.
Great talk. Boy, some intriguing factors there. We're right on time, so I'll keep moving along, and Benjamin's helping me here. So our next speaker is Benjamin Rice, who's also a PhD candidate. We're taking you back for his work to Africa, to Madagascar, where he's been working with what we heard was Harvard's first planetary health assistant, Professor Chris Golden, right?
Generally, we aim to better understand the interactive dynamics of habitat variation and human health using malaria in Madagascar as a case study. More specifically, we are interested in the ways in which ongoing land use change and habitat fragmentation can lead to increased malaria transmission. Malaria caused by parasites in the genus Plasmodium and in Africa primarily by the species Plasmodium falciparum is transmitted between hosts by Anopheles mosquito vectors. While laudable progress has been made in the last 2 decades, persistent hotspots of elevated incidence cause that to remain a major burden in endemic countries, Madagascar included. To this aim, working with my co-advisors Chris Golden and Dan Hartle and their teams, we have ongoing efforts to first characterize habitat and habitat preference by using satellite imagery data streams and on-the-ground sampling of mosquitoes. Second, we aim to characterize health of the rural, remote communities living in these areas using empirical surveys with on-site diagnostics and subsequent laboratory analysis, including genetic analysis of pathogens. And we're going to pair all that with extensive questionnaires. The basic idea here, laid out by previous pioneering work in the Amazon and elsewhere, is that reductions in forest cover, such as from converting formerly forested areas to rice fields, lead to changes in the abundance of certain microhabitats, changes such as increased sunlight exposure at ground level and increased standing water. Anopheles mosquito larvae prefer some such microhabitats, and thus increasing the amount of cultivated land can change the abundance of the microhabitats suitable for Anopheles vectors. As an outcome, this change in the vectorial potential of the landscape can lead to a change in the burden of prevalence of malaria for local communities. And while these linkages have been explored before, Madagascar has a unique and extremely variable ecology and dynamics are in part dependent on the local ecology and mosquito vector biology at play. We also seek to integrate new data types, primarily genetic data, as genetic data can allow historical insight for populations in which historical data is lacking. To introduce the scale and urgency, there's evidence that progress in the control of malaria in Madagascar has slowed, stalled, and in some cases, in some parts of the country, malaria has even been increasing. Here, for example, is data from the National Malaria Control Program showing in red large zones of the country that remain at higher average prevalence in more recent reports than was observed in 2011. When malaria slows or stalls, malaria is able to re-expand out of the unreached pockets where transmission remained locally high and sustained. Therefore, there's renewed motivation to find better ways to understand and screen for underlying drivers. Estimates also place Madagascar among the countries that have seen the highest rates of forest loss in the 21st century. If we zoom into the northeast, one of our study zones, there's been an average of 1,500 hectares of unplanned forest losses per year in the Makira area alone, driven by the widespread expansion of cultivated land, which is primarily subsistence rice farming. As may be difficult to see in these maps, as visualized here, between 1995 and 2011, there's a significant increase in the blue, brown, and yellow areas, indicating agricultural land. Returning to the schematic, we have seen evidence that land use change is ongoing and widespread in some areas of Madagascar, and next we can connect this to changes in Anopheles vector habitat density by looking at the habitat preferences of Anopheles mosquitoes in Madagascar. Here we see that from collecting thousands of mosquitoes across multiple ecoregions of Madagascar, the proportion of mosquitoes captured that are the Anopheles vectors that transmit malaria, which are shown in darker blue here, is noticeably higher in human-dominated habitats, such as inside households and cleared areas surrounding communities, or an adjacent partially degraded habitat than is found in intact forest. Likewise, we see that Anopheles larvae are most commonly observed in human-modified water bodies, such as rice fields. And to put this simply, we expect the density of microhabitats suitable for Anopheles to increase when land is converted. Next, we can explore this linkage between vector habitat and the transmission potential of a landscape. And here are empirical estimates for the average prevalence in the rural remote sites we surveyed, broken down by region of the country. We attempted to survey across the diverse ecosystems of Madagascar, where habitat ranges from humid tropical forest in the northeast to semi-arid, succulent-rich, spiny forest in the southwest, in order to understand these linkages in a diversity of ecological contexts. When we compare estimates we obtain from the rural and remote sites in these regions to overall regional averages, we see that prevalence is often noticeably higher for the remote communities on the progressing edge of land use conversion. For example, in Mananzari in the southeast, prevalence for a community was significantly correlated with distance from more heavily populated and more urban areas. And for more details on this, please, I encourage everyone to see the poster by Nick Arisco during the poster session. However, we're limited by a lack of historical data due to inadequate government or other surveillance in these communities before land use change occurred, we lack the data to make direct pre- and post comparisons in these regions in Madagascar. We are also limited by the fact that behavioral, socioeconomic, and numerous other complex factors play a significant role in one's probability of becoming infected with malaria. To highlight the complexity, we can look at the variation in prevalence between sites within the same region. Note that geographically close sites can vary in prevalence greatly, such as in northeastern Madagascar, shown in blue here, or in orange for southeastern Madagascar. Similarly, we can look at variation in malaria prevalence within households in the same community. Individuals, which are shown as boxes that become filled in red if they are observed to be infected, are shown in the actual observed household configuration, for example, from a site from southeast Madagascar here. And we observe variation in the individuals infected among and between households, with some households with up to all 8 members infected and some with much less. This indicates that more micro to more macro scale factors may play a significant mediating role, and affirm that models aimed at understanding the link between land use and malaria risk in Madagascar need to account for these factors acting at different spatial scales. To this aim, the Meharry team is working to integrate data on individual factors such as bed net use, household scale factors such as proximity of the household to larval sites that we can calculate from mapping efforts, community access to healthcare resources, among others. As mentioned before, in addition to the complex suite of mediating factors, an additional difficulty is that malaria transmission can vary dramatically over time and space and often occurs in difficult to access communities. Therefore, sufficient baseline data to probe the effect of things like land use change directly is often lacking. Genetic data can then be of great interest as historical trends for a population can be inferred from the pattern of genetic variation among the malaria parasites circulating in that population. To illustrate this, we can survey a group of individuals, shown as black figures, that become red if infected with malaria, and calculate the percentage that are infected at the time of sampling. However, the observed level of prevalence could have arisen from multiple historical scenarios. Here on the top, for example, the high level of prevalence was achieved from a recent or temporary uptick in transmission. Alternatively, for example, on the bottom, the high level of prevalence could have come from a historically stable high transmission. We are motivated to try to discriminate the scenarios because we would draw different conclusions and suggest different strategies for intervention based on different historical trends. If prevalence was a result of a sudden increase in transmission, response should focus on proximate causes and an acute response to halt the increase as soon as possible. On the other hand, if prevalence was the result of stable, entrenched high transmission, then that indicates the need to holistically address localized underlying factors, and also to prioritize these sustained hotspots for sustained intervention so that they do not become refuges for malaria that endanger control success being met elsewhere. Genotyping malaria parasites in the individual sampled can be thought of as assigning a new barcode to the genotypes or strains of malaria present, we can call them. Here this is represented by giving infections different colors corresponding to different strains. Here above there are 2 strains, blue and a red one, circulating in that population. If malaria transmission has been stably high, parasites have been rapidly shuttled between individuals over time, and there is thus a higher probability that individuals already infected with a strain of malaria get reinfected by another strain. This is shown by individuals that have multiple colors. These mixed infections then allow the strains to recombine when taken up by the next mosquito bite and form even more novel strains. Therefore, a greater proportion of individuals with mixed infections and a greater number of distinct genetic barcodes present among the pool of parasites circulating in a community indicates that transmission has been consistent over time, or been more consistent over time. For an example of this in use, we observed there we go. For example of this in use, we observed a prevalence that was 2 to 3 times above regional average in study sites that were forest adjacent in northeastern Madagascar. Genetic sampling revealed high levels of genetic diversity, many unique barcodes, and that more than 2/3 of the infections sampled were mixed infections. This genetic data is consistent with sustained higher transmission and therefore provides support that elevated prevalence that we observed was not an artifact of a transient spike preceding our sampling, and we can therefore propose that increased sustained and holistic intervention is warranted. And to quickly summarize, I discussed our ongoing work to understand the linkages between land use change and malaria outcomes in Madagascar, and introduce the potential utility of integrating genetic data into those efforts. Our future work seeks to expand on this and can hope that it can serve as an example of the merits of a multidisciplinary, cross-scale planetary health framework to identify and intervene in upstream drivers in complex systems. And thank you to the people who made this work possible, especially Chris Golden, my advisor, Hervé Rangiamati, and Nick. And thank you.
Thanks very much, Benjamin. And for the last two presentations in this session, we have a double bill with Matt Bones and Sandra Telfer, a focus on Madagascar, why plague? So Matt is an assistant professor of global health and social medicine at Harvard Medical School and also co-chief executive officer of Pivot, accessible and comprehensive healthcare services and research to break cycles of poverty and disease in Madagascar. But Sandra's going to start off. Sandra's a bit closer to home from the University of Aberdeen, where she's a Wellcome Trust Senior Research Fellow and with a background in ecology. Sandra, welcome.
Thanks very much. So many of you may be aware that there was an outbreak of plague in Madagascar last year. And in fact, Madagascar has some of the highest incidence of plague each year. And so today, Matt and I are going to give a presentation that talks about some of the environmental, socio-economic and health system factors that are affecting this situation. I'm going to start off by talking about the ecology and the epidemiology of plague in Madagascar, and then focusing on one example of how environmental change can impact on plague risk. And then Matt's going to give a bit more detail about last year's outbreak and the importance of an effective health system response. So plague is a zoonosis. It normally circulates within rodent populations and is transmitted by fleas. And infected fleas that leave dead rodents that have died from the infection can bite humans and give them bubonic plague. And if left untreated, bubonic plague can develop into pneumonic plague, which is much more deadly and can be transmitted person to person. So plague is present in rodent populations in several countries in the world, but the highest burden of disease in humans is in Africa. And you can see from the map, primarily in DRC and Madagascar. So plague arrived in Madagascar just over a century ago to the eastern port of Tamasina, and it then spread to other coastal ports, and then spread inland to the Central Highlands. It disappeared from the coast, but became endemic in those green areas in that map in the Central Highlands. And that's largely in areas above 800 meters in altitude. So why did plague manage to persist in Madagascar? So as for any zoonosis, understanding the hosts and the vectors is key to understanding the distribution and risk. And in the Central Highlands in Madagascar, that principally involves the black rat and two flea species. So the black rat is an invasive species in Madagascar. It arrived several centuries ago, and it's very abundant and present in almost all habitats. And we know that it's sensitive to plague, which means that some individuals die and release fleas that can then bite humans. The tropical rat flea, Synopsilla chiopus, was introduced with the rats, and we know that it is a suitable vector for plague, but in Madagascar, it's largely found on rats' in-houses, and it seems that an endemic flea species from Madagascar that has successfully colonized black rats is key to the persistence of plague, because its distribution closely matches the distribution of plague, so above 800 meters in altitude. So that's the situation that allowed plague to become endemic in Madagascar. But of course, environmental change can impact on host and vector populations and therefore disease risk. And so I just wanted to talk about one example in detail of the complexities of how that can work. And in particular, using data that's been collected over 20 years to understand how further biological invasions have changed the host community structure and disease risk in Majunga. So Majunga is a coastal port, so it's outside the typical plague area in Madagascar. And after 60 years with no plague, plague re-emerged in the 1990s. And there was 4 large annual outbreaks of plagues in humans. But since then, there have been no confirmed cases of plague. So recent genetic information from the isolates obtained from the outbreaks showed that this plague was reintroduced to Majunga from the Central Highlands. So why did it successfully reinvade when there was no Synopsilus funkeni present? So in fact, the whole epidemiology of plague in Majunga is very different. At the time of the outbreaks, the small mammal community was dominated by 4 species of invasive hosts. There were black rats and house mice present, but there were also brown rats, which was a more recent invader, and also large numbers of the musk shrew. And at the time, it was thought that due to the abundance and some isolation of plague from the musk shrew, that it must be playing a role. But it's only in data collected since the outbreaks that the exact sort of epidemiology has managed to be determined. So at the same time as there was a drastic reduction in the number of human cases, there was a big change in the community structure of hosts in Majunga. So immediately after the epidemics, you can see the sudden decline in the number of musk shrews, and there's also a rise in the number of brown rats. And at the same time, the flea abundance on the shrews has declined. However, it's not that plague has disappeared again from Majunga, because plague was isolated from a rat just recently, and it's been shown that that is a genotype closely related to the genotypes that were circulating in the epidemics in the 1990s. So instead, it seems as if the frequency of transmission between different hosts within the system and differences in the resistance of these hosts plays a crucial role in decreasing the number of human cases. So this graph just sort of highlights that difference in resistance between the different hosts. So you can see in purple, the black rat, highly susceptible, most infections are lethal. But the musk shrew in red is much more resistant, and the brown rat is intermediate between the two. So it seems as if plague successfully reinvaded Majunga and colonized the shrew population, and that during the outbreaks, spillover from these shrews into the brown rats then resulted in spillover to humans, because the rats were more susceptible to dying and releasing infected fleas. But since then, the frequency of spillover events between the different hosts has declined, probably due to the lower shrew abundance and fewer fleas. So this has been a result of a combination of ecological and genetic information that has allowed us to look at that. So in other urban areas, there have also been significant changes in the small mammal community that have actually reduced plague risk in the urban areas. And you can see on the pie charts that in rural communities, the communities are still dominated by the susceptible black rat, but urbanization has favored the brown rat. And although it's not as resistant as the shrew, it is more resistant to the black rat. And so when plague gets into urban areas, fewer rats die than in rural areas, and so there's less transmission to humans. So whilst changes in urban areas appear to have decreased the risk of plague over the last 50 years or so, it's important to realize that other environmental change, such as deforestation and climate, are likely to be having different effects on hosts and vectors in other areas of the country. And so it's important that we understand how these environmental changes are impacting the hosts and the exact role that those hosts play in transmitting infections to humans. I think it's also relevant that because urban areas are less used to dealing with plague, this may have contributed to the scale of the outbreak last year, as many of the health centres that were dealing with pneumonic plague cases were relatively unused to dealing with plague cases. And Matt's now going to talk more about the importance of the effective health system response.
Hello. Thank you. This is an interesting talk for me. I'm actually trained as an economist and an ecologist, and it's interestingly, my interest and commitment to planetary health has gotten me in the business of providing healthcare for folks. So that's what I want to talk about. Plague is a great example for how important and integrated health systems and planetary health are. So just as a quick timeline, it was late August when the first case of pneumonic plague happened. It was a gentleman who ended up taking a taxi bus through the capital in Antananarivo and was headed to the coast and went from malaria-like symptoms to respiratory-type symptoms, so from bubonic-type symptoms to pneumonic-type symptoms, and died along the way. And there was a burial. It is thought that 30 other people were infected in the process. And the result is that you end up having an outbreak of pneumonic, directly transmitted plague in a capital, highly densely populated area. So I don't know how many of you are paying attention to this, but it caused quite a scare, an Ebola-like scare of pneumonic plague is 100% fatal if not treated. Bubonic plague is estimates are about 1/3 fatal if untreated. And so it took about a couple weeks after this initial infection before the outbreak was officially detected by the national government, and then a few more weeks after that before the international community mobilized a response. In total, over the course of the outbreak, there was a couple thousand infections, supposedly a couple hundred. This is actually it's actually a couple hundred deaths, about 207 deaths, so a slightly outdated number. Maybe a couple lessons from this graph are one, that this came out of season. Normally, plague peaks in warm, moist climates like December and January, and then it was very responsive to the international emergency response. So plague is actually very easy to treat, responds quite well to most generically produced antibiotics. So it worked. And so broadly, the international response was get antibiotics to people, do contact tracing, engage community health workers, provide prophylaxis for people who may have been in contact, get the supply chain of diagnostics in play. So the key message here is that there's a few drivers here. There's the ecological driver, there's a socio-demographic driver of how people are moving around, and then there's a health system issue. And just to emphasize this one more time, the international response was needed because the health system had broken down, right? So it's very inexpensive to treat plague. Madagascar is one of the poorest countries in the world, lowest per capita spending on healthcare in the world. One of the reasons why it was happening is because people weren't getting treated, and so it was spreading. So I work with an organization called Pivot that works in the Southeast. We are a health system strengthening organization. We do a lot of health care delivery. And we have been in place for a few years now, about 4 years in Madagascar, and we are mobilized around the plague response. Our actual goal is to create a model health system for the country. And we have our lens, or kind of our eye, on issues of planetary health and sustainable development, but our kind of vehicle for this is through a concept of a model health district. This is a Ifanadine district. That's a map. If you can see that, it happens to look kind of like Madagascar. People confuse that. It's actually just a piece of Madagascar. And this is just to give you a sense of sort of the access to healthcare that we find in our district, the distribution of health centers. And the key to our approach is that we are very human-centered. We're interested in each individual patient, each individual person in our district. We intervene at the systems level. We produce data at all levels of that system that I think are not precedented. So this is kind of impossible to read probably for you, but basically this is highlighting, actually some icons are disappeared too, but basically there's multiple levels of a district health system, of any health system. There's hospital, there's secondary levels, there's primary levels, health centers, and there's community health. We operate at all of those levels and all of the health centers and the hospital and all the community health workers. And we strengthen those. To strengthen those means supply chain, infrastructure, human resources, and then we integrate vertical programs, clinical programs, family planning, maternal child health, and that includes an emergency response, such as with plague. I should say that, and we integrate this with data systems. So this is household surveys, large longitudinal cohort studies, survey of about 9,000 people, along with health management information systems, data from registries, data from the community health worker system. And so what that means is, in a case like this, when plague was happening, we were knowing in real time exactly where this is. These are just different regions of our own district. You can't even read these numbers, but basically the red is where we had most of the plague happening. This is, I get a map like this actually generated weekly during the outbreak. And so we did more or less a version of what the national response was. We had these mass awareness campaigns, big sensitization, community health workers engaged, and antibiotics being provided at the health centers, active case finding. This is just examples, just to show you some imagery of what this process looked like. We're a very rural district. It takes a couple days to get some of the health centers from the central area, so we're walking, we, meaning our teams, are walking, going over rivers and through fields, delivering antibiotics and support. This is just one community health center in the north. And this is actually what a rural health center looks like. This is one of the health centers that we had not yet reached, but are part of our ultimate strategic plan. That's what the pharmacy looks like. So you can see why sometimes people don't go to get help that they need. These are the wards, primary care wards. And so this is a boy who was diagnosed and treated for plague and ended up surviving. And this is what it's supposed to look like. These are health centers that we've actually strengthened. We have 50, on the left here, 50 community health posts that we've been working with villages to support. And there's an ambulance that we donated to the central government to respond to plague. So a major point here is that, I'm about out of time, unfortunately, but the major point here is that 200 people died of plague. Since then, maybe about 20,000 have died from malaria, diarrheal disease, and pneumonia. Very treatable. A systems approach is super important for treating the actual burden of disease in these areas, but also important for an emergency response. We've seen since then under 5 mortality drop by about 9% per year since we started. Utilization quadruple. And the data systems give us a really strong sense of what's happening. This is access to people with symptoms like plague in our region over time. So finally, we think this kind of approach, we're in households, we're in the community, we're in the health centers, we're getting data of different unprecedented. We think this is a really powerful way to build out a system from individual to health system to the planet. The left is patterns of forest loss that we think we can use to help understand larger drivers. So finally, plague is a deadly disease that's highly treatable. The outbreak is due to ecology, socio-demographics, and health system failures. The health system response to plague and other illnesses can support planetary health. The key to our approach is that we're focused on individual care, so kids who are under 10 can survive to help us with this agenda of planetary health, strengthen the systems, and integrate the data and science. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt and Sandra. So now we're going to have the stimulating discussion, dialogue, questions, answers that really are the most important part of this session. So I realize it's a lot of information. It may seem overwhelming. So hopefully we're going to take a 45, well, let's make it a full minute for you to turn to a close neighbor. You can do it in pairs or threes or whatever, and bounce around some of the questions that you might have that you'd like to bring forward. Especially be thinking about, has this stimulated your thoughts about how what we've talked about, nitrogen, infectious diseases of different kinds, poverty, how all of those are related to planetary health, and how does that fit in, and what are some of the approaches that we think about in planetary health that might be applicable in these cases, okay? So let's take 1 minute and meet your neighbor and exchange some ideas, and then please line up for some questions. Okay, so how are those questions coming? All right, so we can come back. Feel free to go up to the mics. What we thought we'd do, if we could get everybody's attention, this is great actually, all the buzz, this means it's working. You're all meeting new people and talking about new ideas. But can we come back? Whoop. Everybody, just for a minute. All right, please don't hesitate to line up. Okay, so what we thought we'd start out, just as a warm-up, because we covered so much, is all of the panelists have talked about, our first day with the nitrogen, and then we talked about infectious diseases in most all of the talks from different perspectives. So I've asked them to just quickly review, okay, so that it's really clear how what they presented, what are the planetary health factors or considerations or issues that are key, all right, to the either the nitrogen or to the different disease or outbreak or case studies that they discussed. Okay, just as a quick review, just to help everybody. Okay, so David, he started with a factor, but he actually has some disease impacts associated with that as well. Are the mics? We need the mics on. They're on. Try.
They're on.
Go ahead.
You can, great. Yeah. So in terms of the MOOC, which hopefully you've now got onto your devices, the connections with planetary health there are made quite clear in terms of obviously in terms of air quality impacts, also water quality through blue baby syndrome. So this water we're drinking now has strict reactive nitrogen, so nitrate limits because of its risk if you have high intakes. The harmful algal bloom story, so eutrophication we're seeing around the world. The big one for me, the one I'd emphasize, and it's come through all day, I suppose, is the global challenge of food, of feeding nearly 10 billion people by the middle of the century. Not just feeding them, but providing good nutrition, so micronutrient as well as macronutrient supply. And nitrogen is an amazing tool for that. I love the stuff because it does enable us to increase productivity. It has this big risk attached to it if we use it inefficiently, but when we get it right, actually it allows us to address what is this huge looming challenge of food security globally and gives us more resilience to climate change. So food would be my key.
Good. So we might need a little bit briefer, okay, as we go down the line. Valtrina and Peter.
Yeah, I think what I would mention is really that when I think about planetary health, we're balancing the needs of populations with the needs of the planet. And the challenge that we're facing now is that we're hitting carrying capacity. So in addition to providing more food and more resources, probably something we haven't talked about as much as we could is really thinking about the population and how can family planning and choices that go along with really trying to provide high quality life for those who are on this planet, how that could move forward. And so that fits in as the socio-economic piece that would probably complement what we talked about in our Tanzania presentation.
Peter.
Yeah, and just as we are talking about planetary health, that bringing more players into the equation, we also need, when those players are in the equation, we need to bring the different socio-environmental factors into the equation as well. Because we may have a very good plan, we may have a very good solid team of planetary health practitioners, but when you go in the ground and you forget some of the drivers, the whole thing might blow up. So we need to bring, to know what are the drivers on the ground and to attack them using different means that we will develop.
Good. Well.
So I think, yeah, this is on here. So I think in terms of my presentation as well, it's pretty much what Vatrina and Peter sort of echoed, that we do need to bring in different people from different backgrounds. With regards to agriculture, I mentioned that there was climate change impacts as well, air pollution, and the Planetary Health Forum basically provides a platform for all of us to integrate, work together to sort of tackle these challenges. So, yeah.
Ben.
Yeah, just to echo what's been said before, I think increasingly human-dominated landscapes can contain specific characteristics that increase their transmission potential for malaria and other diseases. However, characterizing that linkage requires multidisciplinary work to address all those mediating factors, and it requires novel metrics to address data limitations, and that's sort of a common thread, I think.
Yeah, just probably to echo that the environmental change can impact infectious diseases in many complex ways, but of course that obviously interacts with lots of socioeconomic factors, and specifically in terms of who is infected, and that really needs to be built in.
Thanks. I think for me the one big message that connects to planetary health is just the importance of action in partnership with the communities and the government. So There's plague, people die of plague, and we want a response to that. And in the process, we can start building out things like our family planning agenda, et cetera, which we do that as well, as part of the overall health system response. Thanks.
Okay, do we have anybody brave enough to start off the questions? Please, if you would, when you do, if you could identify yourself, please, and then we'll take the questions. We'll probably take 2 or 3 at a time. Yes.
Hi, just a very focused question. I'm Jeff Wyatt. I'm a veterinarian and board member for Health and Harmony. I have a question about the plague in Madagascar. Was part of the strategy or a way to control plague to control the vector, to the invasive rat species?
Boy, we could take that question since we only have 3 people. Go ahead.
So I think controlling the black rat in Madagascar would be very challenging. It's in nearly all habitats, including pretty much pristine forest. What they do as a response to specific plague outbreaks is insecticide treatment, so trying to tackle the fleas essentially. But I think there's still a lot of work to really understand how people are exposed. So that treatment, insecticide treatment, is normally focused around houses. But actually, one of the key vector species is found around rice fields. And so a big question is, where are people when they are exposed?
Next question.
Hi, Kathy Baldwin, University of Oxford, speaking up for the social scientists. Why isn't there a behavioural scientist on your panel? Because if we think about prevention and control of infectious diseases, a lot of the factors that put people at risk of exposure are behavioural, and it's what people do and the places that they're in. So I'm very surprised that in terms of prevention and control, you don't have a behavioural perspective. If we look at Ebola, for example, one of the key transmission sites was around funerals and unsafe burial practices. There was a behavioural factor in the transmission of that epidemic. So I would suggest that planetary health needs to do more actual real work to bring in the social and behavioural scientists.
Yeah, I think you've made an excellent point. And I was going to say that the organizers who put this panel together and invited us to moderate, I think they just had very interesting presentations to sort of start the dialogue about infectious disease and other and the nitrogen situation. But I think your point's very well taken as we think forward to the next Planetary Health Conference to have maybe a more comprehensive panel that includes more of the social scientists, which is your point is very well taken. Others want to comment on that? Yes, Matt.
I'm an economist, and people are always telling me, why don't you get a social scientist as a part of your proposal? I say, I'm a social scientist, I think. Not only am I a social scientist, we do field-based work at the household level, but actually our interventions have social teams. We have social workers going to people's homes, identify sources of problems, whether it's for whatever, malnutrition, tuberculosis, pneumonia, or plague. And a response is a social response in terms of what the family needs, and then to comply with a treatment regimen, and then to get at larger problems. So I didn't talk about social science, but I like to think of myself as having a social approach. I'm in a department of social medicine. Thanks.
And for the other panelists, are there behavioralists or social scientists that you either have involved with your projects or are planning to involve? And if you'd like to make a comment on that.
Make a quick comment. Yeah, I think it's a great question. We do need more of that. We do include that as part of our teams now, and I think that is a really important lever and intervention point. But that has sometimes been a challenge with starting with the word health in mind, is sometimes we don't bring some of the behavior and psychology and even economics and anthropology in as quickly as we would like. So maybe all of you know wonderful people who would love to be at the table and can find ways to bring them in. I think we do need more of that, and it would be great to embrace that.
And that's a really good point. So everybody must know some people working in those fields. Tell them about this conference. Tell them what you've learned. Engage in that conversation and invite them to go to the Planetary Health Alliance website, learn more about planetary health, and come to the next conference. Let's go over this side a second. Yes.
I'm Ibrahim Seriki from Afenet, Nigeria. Yeah, we know outbreaks usually expose weak health systems, and these zoonosis infections are re-emerging. Some we've seen in the past, and they're now coming back due to environmental factors, like she mentioned, like climate change, deforestation, and increasing human population. But my question is this: we as healthcare workers, we try to curtail outbreak by contact tracing, surveillance, and case management, as well as maybe vaccination campaign. But the challenge we're experiencing mostly is that how does the environmental health specialist help us in managing outbreaks?
Okay. Sorry, since we only have less than 10 minutes left, I think we'll take all of the questions and then we'll turn it over to the panel to answer. Yes?
Esther Ngumbi, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So I'm wondering, talking about how do we deal with poverty, how can we incorporate empowerment in the solutions that we are proposing? I mean, I think of how do we, when we're talking to the person that's afflicted, like the farmers you're working, or the poultry keepers, how do you engage them in ways that as they tackle the solution, they can be able to make money innovatively? Secondly, I'm just also going to add, why are we missing an entomologist in your panel and a plant health person? Because there's no food security without plants, and we know that insects cause 50%. Like right now, we are dealing with an insect invasion in Africa, the fall armyworm. We all know about that. So I think that's part of something. And the final question is, how bottom up are we making these solutions? Are we just scientists or experts who are just breathing down these solutions and expecting them to be sustainable? Or if we want to build sustainability, should we start bottom up? And I wonder why 30 years later we still are talking about the same issues. What are we going to do that's different so that our children do not have to talk about poverty, ending all these issues that we face today? Thank you.
Excellent. Wow. All right, you've been thinking of transformational questions. Good job. Yes.
Yes, I'd like to make a sort of a statement, but also ask some questions. I'm from the World Agroforestry Center in Nairobi. We're all about trees on landscapes, and I'd like to add the landscape component to health here. If you're worried about disasters, it's trees that slow down floods, it's trees that hold water on the landscape. If you're worried about agricultural productivity, it's trees that put nitrogen and carbon into the soil, and the carbon itself holds water like a sponge. I'd like to give a shout for livestock. Livestock are very important in farming systems in Africa and all over the world. Many people keep livestock for manure, not just for milk and food. Trees also have a role in controlling air pollution, and trees are also assets. And we have done research in Western Kenya, which shows that families that have been practicing agroforestry are less likely to resort to detrimental coping strategies like removing children from school and selling vital assets like plows and seeds when they have trees on their farms.
So do we have a question?
No, actually I think I don't have a question.
Okay.
I think I'd like to bring it up. We need a bit more
provocative
landscape.
comment. Okay, so we can see we're clearly going to have to expand in the future and talk more about the plants and the trees, and we're all in support of that. So let's take comments in terms of those questions and comments from our panelists. Yes.
So on the trees, absolutely. They're a fantastic ecosystem, or part of ecosystems, and give so many ecosystem services. I love the question, though, about where does the science become action? Where does it actually have an impact? And where does it go from kind of papers in Science and Nature to actually, farmers, in the case of nitrogen, in terms of the people we work with, actually building that capacity. My favorite example recently has been, we work a lot in India. India has a big nitrogen challenge in terms of air quality and ammonia emissions, and obviously a huge agricultural sector. And what we've seen there is a thing which is a leaf color chart. So one of the things you can see with your crops is if they need more nitrogen, they tend to go yellow. And so this simple leaf color chart is something which they were already using in certain parts of India, and we have a program on nitrogen across South Asia where that good practice is being shared. It's not high tech, it's not something that's come through Nature and Science papers, it's just something which works on the ground through nitrogen use efficiency. And that kind of capacity building is something which I think is really important, not just in nitrogen and planetary health, but in so much of what we've talked about today.
Other comments in relation to the questions? Yeah, Matt. Go ahead, Matt.
I'd like to make a comment about a couple of these different comments about, when are we going to actually solve problems from the bottom up. I'll say that, my own diagnosis of why some of these challenges persist is because solutions are not locally integrated. The conversation can happen in Edinburgh or can happen in a capital, and there's a lot of different science coming to bear, and actually a lot of pretty good solutions that are being proposed, but they're often implemented in totally uncoordinated ways. And when I say totally uncoordinated, I mean completely uncoordinated. And that's not necessary. Where we work, just to be completely clear, we work exclusively in the public health system. We work with community health workers that are exclusively part of the community health, part of the public administrative health, public health system, and we strengthen according to national policies. And I think just to be totally clear, we are solving these problems. Our under-5 mortality rate is dropping at twice the rate required to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and fertility rates are dropping, et cetera. So these problems are actually kind of solvable. I think what I would add is that if you do the local integration, those long-term community relationships, and align yourself with national policy, it's possible. I would add that I think we could do environmental-based community health workers, right? Planetary health workers at the local level, I think seems possible, but you'd run into the same challenge we see in global health, which is they need to be professionalized, paid, et cetera. It's doable, it just needs to be supported locally.
Planetary health workers, there we go. Any other, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I think on the issue of poverty, I think my sister actually posed the question and an answer at the same time. The answer to this question is empowerment, that you empower the people who are living in poverty so that they understand the type of interventions that you want to put in with regard to their health. If you go now and talk about your interventions without considering their situation, that intervention has failed even before you start. So as the tone has been set since morning, we are talking about us providing evidence, solid evidence to the politicians, to the governments, to be able to change the way things are done. And one of the way things are done that can be changed is to empower people to move out of poverty. And I think how bottom-up that is, that should actually be really bottom-up, shouldn't be up from up-down, should be bottom-up, because we need to know what they can actually do. What resources do they have to start moving up?
Really, very good point. We're going to have to wrap it up. Real quick, Raul.
Obviously, these are very complex systems. On the one hand, we have to feed, 10 billion by 2050, and then on the other hand, we have these disbenefits which are occurring at the same time. And so it's not there's no one silver bullet which is going to solve all of our problems in one go. It's more of a question of integrating different interventions at the same time to try and meet all of these sustainable development goals.
Okay, so let me hand over to Jeff to sort of wrap us up.
Thank you very much, Pat. We've heard some great examples this afternoon of actions in response to some key planetary health challenges. One thing that has united many of those is a sort of systems approach to addressing these challenges, and I think that's something we can all learn from in our various endeavors related to planetary health challenges. I think a theme coming strongly through in both the presentations and the questions is the desire to move beyond excellent papers, which we all want, and that's great, but to impact on the ground. And I thought the suggestion about a greater involvement of social scientists was highly relevant in this regard. I think that social scientists can really help us frame the right questions and address these challenges in a way that maximizes the likelihood of solutions being relevant and adopted and long-lasting. When it comes to things like food, which is again sort of resurfaced in this discussion, It's incredibly complex understanding why people eat what they do, and I think social scientists can help us understand the cultural, historical, psychological, as well as nutritional dimensions to that question. So as Wendy said earlier, asking the right question is incredibly powerful, and I think many of us would agree that social scientists can help us ask the right question and definitely scope for a greater role in the endeavors we are discussing in these few days. So last but not least, I think agriculture, agroforestry, and food are very definitely part of the problem around planetary health, but equally, definitely, they need to be part of the solution. It's great to see the emphasis on these disciplines in this conference, and long may it continue. Please join with me in thanking the speakers in this afternoon's session.